The voice on the phone made my blood run cold, barely a ragged whisper, like whoever was calling was speaking from a dark corner. "Don't eat anything. They've put poison on your plate." I felt my breath catch, the world grinding to a halt around the table filled with laughter and raised glasses. It was New Year's Eve dinner, the time when a family is supposed to come together to celebrate life, to give thanks, and to toast to the future. But in that instant, everything changed. I looked around, my stomach in knots. They were all there, my wife, my kids, my grandkids, my sons-in-law, my daughters-in-law, even a couple of cousins who'd come from out of state. Every face became suspicious. Every smile looked like a mask. I set the phone down on the table, acting like nothing had happened, while the voice kept echoing in my head. "Don't eat anything." I swallowed hard and looked at my plate, the freshly carved turkey, the side salads, the wine glasses glinting under the candlelight, a feast that suddenly looked like a minefield. I tried to smile, but my jaw was rigid. I wondered if anyone would notice the tension in my face, and that's when I told the first lie of the night. I put a hand to my stomach, faked a sudden pain, and said with a forced voice, "Forgive me. I think the wine didn't agree with me. I'm heading to the bathroom." I got up slowly, feeling the weight of all their eyes on me. Were they looking at me with genuine concern, or with the nervousness of someone afraid their plan had been found out? My heart was pounding in my chest like a drum as I walked down the hallway to the bathroom. I locked the door and braced myself against the sink, breathing hard. The mirror reflected a face I didn't recognize, a 60-year-old man, aged suddenly, with wild eyes and pale skin. I gripped the cold marble and heard the warning in my head again. I tried to reason, but my mind was a whirlwind. Who could have made that call? A neighbor who saw something? A member of my own family, full of last-minute regret? Or maybe someone just wanted to mess with me, to play on my fear? I couldn't know. The only thing I knew for sure was that someone at that table, where my entire life was gathered, wanted me dead. And they wanted to do it in the cruelest way. On New Year's Eve, in front of everyone, with a poison that would turn the celebration into a tragedy. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to get a grip. I couldn't just run out screaming. I couldn't make a scene without proof. If I did, I'd risk looking like a paranoid old man, turning the whole family against me. I needed time. I took a deep breath. I straightened up and told myself, "Stay calm. Watch. Listen. Find out who it is." With that resolve, I opened the door and went back to the dining room, like an actor returning to the stage, only half knowing his lines. When I walked in, everyone was laughing. My grandkids were singing off-key Christmas carols. My daughter was pouring more wine. My son-in-law was making an impromptu toast. Life was going on as if nothing had happened. But for me, every gesture was a clue, every word a veiled threat. My plate was still untouched, waiting like a set trap. I faked that the discomfort was continuing and asked just for water. I noticed some of them exchange quick glances, as if I'd ruined something with my absence. Or maybe it was just my imagination. Dinner dragged on, slow, endless. I barely touched a thing, while everyone else ate enthusiastically. Was it possible only my plate was poisoned, or was all the food poisoned, and only I had been warned? Every time someone offered me a piece of turkey or some salad, I felt a chill. I refused it all with a weak smile, repeating the excuse about my stomach ache. But inside me, a fear was simmering, slowly turning into suspicion, and suspicion into rage. I watched each of them closely. My wife was laughing too loudly, as if trying to cover something up. My eldest son, always so observant, was avoiding my gaze. My youngest daughter, who I'd argued with about money weeks ago, had a smile that looked forced. And my son-in-law, he worried me the most. He raised his glass with too much enthusiasm, like someone celebrating more than just the new year. He was drinking heavily, and at one point, I thought I saw him glance at my untouched plate with a flash of impatience. The clock struck midnight. The hugs, the toasts, the Happy New Years all blurred into a deafening noise. I hugged everyone with a fake smile, but inside, I felt like I was hugging snakes. Nobody, absolutely nobody, was off the list. And as I received kisses from my grandkids, the idea hit me like a ton of bricks. Someone at this table, someone of my own blood, had wanted to kill me. I went up to bed early that night. I faked exhaustion and went to the bedroom. I sat on the bed in the dark, phone in hand, waiting for another call, another clue, something to tell me who I should be afraid of. But the phone stayed silent. I could only hear the distant laughter fading from the dining room, the sound of glasses being collected, the voices of my children saying their goodbyes. And in that silence, I understood that the battle had only just begun, because someone in my family wanted me dead. And I, even though I didn't know who it was yet, was ready to find out, even if it meant opening old wounds and facing truths I might not be prepared to hear. I barely slept that night. I tossed and turned like a condemned man, eyes open in the darkness, replaying every detail of the dinner, the voice on the phone, the untouched plate. The smiles I no longer knew were joy or complicity. I couldn't stop asking myself, who among all those who had shared so many years of my life wanted me dead? And then, like an unavoidable reflex, my mind started to drift back in time. I went back to the years when it all began. I was young, barely 20, working myself to the bone to support my first dreams. I married in love, convinced that what we were building together would last forever. I remember my hands, rough from the long shifts at the factory, my back aching, my feet swollen, and still, the satisfaction of coming home and seeing my wife smile. That smile was the engine that kept me going. I never thought about myself. I always thought about them, about my family, about what they needed, about what I had to sacrifice so they could have a better life. Little by little, we built our life. A humble house at first, furniture bought secondhand, and a dream that seemed distant, to give my children a decent future. They grew up on my efforts, and every achievement of theirs was like an invisible medal for me. When my oldest son got into college, I cried with pride. When my youngest daughter learned to play the piano, I applauded her like she was at Carnegie Hall. I was always there, even if exhaustion was tearing me apart, even if the money was tight, even if I sometimes felt my life was just being consumed by giving. But the years also brought wounds. There were arguments, veiled reproaches, silences that weighed more than shouts. My wife started to say I lived more for my work than for the family, and maybe she wasn't wrong. My children, as they grew up, began to see me more as a provider than as a man of flesh and blood, and I accepted it. I thought it was normal. That's how it was supposed to be. The father sacrifices, and everyone else enjoys the sacrifice. I never thought that this role, which I took on with so much love, could become the breeding ground for hidden resentments. Now, at 60, looking back, I'm starting to wonder if the seed of hatred didn't sprout right there, in those sacrifices I never asked to be thanked for, but which others perhaps interpreted as an obligation. Maybe one of my kids felt I owed them more than I could give. Maybe my wife built up resentment in the silences until her heart hardened. Or maybe some son-in-law or daughter-in-law saw me as an obstacle, an inconvenient figure who had to disappear so the inheritance or the power in the family could pass to other hands. As I wrestled with these memories, I realized that betrayal doesn't come from nowhere. The poison on the plate wasn't an isolated act. It was the culmination of something that had been fermenting in the shadows for years. I, so busy supporting everyone, had never looked directly at the small cracks opening in my own home. I had chosen to ignore the shifty eyes, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the jokes behind my back that I thought were harmless. I remembered, with a pang in my heart, an argument with my youngest daughter weeks ago. She chewed me out for not helping her financially with a personal project. I told her I couldn't keep solving everything, that she had to learn to stand on her own. She screamed that I was a stingy old man and slammed the door. It could be her. The very idea destroyed me, but I couldn't rule it out. I also remembered how my oldest son, with whom I'd always had a close relationship, had started to show me a cold distance, as if he no longer needed or wanted my advice. What if there was hidden resentment there, too? Every memory was a blow, every scene a possibility. And yet, what tormented me most was the thought that it could be my own wife. She had been by my side through everything, but she had also been the one who kept the most secrets. Her gaze during dinner, her exaggerated laugh, that way of faking normalcy. Something about her unsettled me more than the others. What if it was her? What motive would she have? Tired of a shared life, a hidden love for someone else, or just the ambition to take what I'd worked so hard to build? The past became a prison that night. I realized that the memories that had always sustained me were now weapons that could be turned against me. What was once pride was now suspicion. What was once sacrifice was now debt. What was once love was now possible hatred, and that transformation was worse than the poison itself. I promised myself I wouldn't be dominated by fear, that I wouldn't let my story, that of a man who gave everything, end in ingratitude and a silent death at the hands of someone close. No. If someone wanted me dead, they would have to face not a weak old man, but a man willing to uncover every secret, to dig up every shadow, to look his own children in the eyes and ask them if they were capable of stabbing me in the heart. Because after everything I gave, the least I deserved was the truth. When I went back down to the dining room that night, after locking my fear away in the bathroom, the first thing I saw was my untouched plate. There it was, waiting for me like a silent threat, with the still warm turkey, the mashed potatoes, the thick gravy dripping over the edge. A plate identical to everyone else's, but which, for me, had the dark gleam of a trap. I sat down slowly, holding my breath, and felt every eye around me pierce me like a knife. No one asked me why I'd taken so long. No one got up to offer help. They kept eating, drinking, and laughing, as if my absence didn't matter, as if they were waiting for me to take the first bite. My hands were trembling under the table. I took my water glass, brought it to my lips, and pretended to drink. I saw my son-in-law watching me from the corner of his eye with an attention that gave me goosebumps. I also saw my wife, who kept her smile, but with a strange stiffness, as if that mask could break at any moment. My youngest daughter, on the other hand, was laughing loudly with her cousin, but her eyes, when they passed over me, seemed to flash with something that wasn't joy. My oldest son, always so serious, avoided looking at me. He was talking to his wife, but every so often his head would turn toward my plate, as if making sure it was still untouched. Time became thick. Every minute was agony. I brought the fork to my mouth in a false gesture, barely touching the food, and then set it down on the plate. I invented another excuse, mumbling that I still felt sick. "Must be the wine," I said. No one pushed it, which seemed even more suspicious. Wasn't it natural for them to encourage me to eat, to offer me something lighter? No. They just nodded, went on with their conversations, as if the fact that I wasn't eating didn't upset the harmony of the table at all. And that, in a family like ours, was strange. I started to observe more closely. I noticed the knife at my plate was placed differently than the others, just slightly crooked, as if someone had put it there in a hurry. The wine in front of me had a slightly darker shade, though I couldn't be sure if it was my imagination. I remembered the anonymous caller's words. "They've put poison on your plate. Not in the food in general, not in the banquet, but on my plate specifically." That precision chilled me again. It meant that whoever did it didn't want an accident. They wanted my death, and only mine. While the others toasted and sang New Year's songs, I felt like I was in a macabre play, where everyone knew the script but me. The children ran around the table, oblivious, happy, and I looked at them with a pang in my heart. What kind of family was this that could laugh while one of them was planning to murder me? What wound had I left so deep that someone would wish me dead? I caught myself watching everyone's hands. My wife cut her meat calmly, but I noticed a slight tremor in her fingers, as if trying to hide her nervousness. My oldest son held his glass with excessive force, to the point where I thought it might break. My daughter, meanwhile, seemed too relaxed, like someone who knows something the others don't. And my son-in-law, he smiled, he toasted, but his eyes kept returning to my plate over and over with an insistence that couldn't be coincidence. At one point, I lifted my napkin, pretending to wipe my mouth, and I noticed something under the plate. A small stain, barely visible, like a white powder dissolved in the gravy that had dripped. My stomach clenched. I didn't touch anything, I didn't say anything, but the confirmation was there, however small. Something had been put in my food, something that wasn't on the other plates. I swallowed hard and felt a coldness run down my spine. Midnight arrived and everyone stood up to toast. I joined in, hugging each one, smiling as if I knew nothing. But as I did, a certainty was already weaving itself in my mind. That untouched plate had become my salvation. The fact that I hadn't tasted it kept me alive, and my silence was now my greatest weapon, because they thought I was still in the dark, that it had gone unnoticed, and they didn't know that, thanks to that anonymous call, I was seeing everything with new eyes. I swore to myself right then that I wouldn't let it go. I would find out who it was, even if I had to dig through every corner of my past, even if I had to look my own children in the eyes and see the enemy in them. I couldn't trust anyone. Betrayal had taken a seat at my table and had tried to kill me on the most symbolic night of the year. And the only thing keeping me standing was my decision not to stay silent, not to let myself be beaten by fear. That night, when the last laugh died down in the house and the last guests left, I was left alone in the bedroom, with the curtains drawn and the lights off. I could still hear the echoes of my family's voices in my head, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the fake normalcy of a dinner that, for me, had been a minefield. I sat on the bed, my head in my hands, and breathed deep. The silence was so thick I could almost touch it, and underneath that silence was something else, a constant buzz of dark thoughts that wouldn't leave me alone. I didn't change my clothes. I didn't get into bed. I just sat there, phone in hand, waiting for another call, a second warning, some clue to tell me who to fear. But the phone stayed dead, mute, as if whoever had saved me wanted to remain invisible. I looked at the screen again and again, staring at the unknown number, wondering if I should call back, if anyone would answer, if that person was an enemy disguised as an ally. Paranoia was creeping in, but at the same time, I was clinging to that anonymous voice as the only lifeline I had left. The minutes stretched into hours. Every sound in the house made me jump. A creak in the hallway, the wind hitting the window, the clock striking 2 a.m. I thought about going down to the kitchen to see the plate, to analyze it, to check with my own eyes if there was something in the food. But I stopped. I was afraid of finding the definitive proof and not knowing what to do with it. I was afraid someone might be waiting for me in the dark kitchen. The house, my own house, felt like enemy territory. I lay back on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling. Then the memories came like sharp knives. I saw in my mind the image of each of them during dinner. The shifty eyes, the nervous smiles, the calculated gestures, my wife laughing too loudly, my son-in-law watching my plate with insistence, my youngest daughter faking nonchalance, my oldest son avoiding my gaze. Every gesture, every movement now became a piece of a twisted puzzle I was trying to assemble in the dark. Rage suddenly hit me, mixed with an unbearable sadness. I'd given them everything, my youth, my strength, my work, my sleepless nights, all so they could have a roof, food, and education, a future. And now one of them, maybe more than one, wanted to take my life. Why? What had I done to deserve this? I felt old, betrayed, but also dangerously clear-headed. For the first time in a long time, the fog of routine was lifting, and I could see them as they really were. The insomnia dragged me into dark thoughts. I thought about death, about what it would have been like if I hadn't gotten that call, if I had taken just one bite. I thought about my grandkids waking up the next day to the news that their grandfather had died at New Year's Eve dinner. I thought about the funeral, the fake eulogies, the crocodile tears. That image turned my stomach and lit a fierce determination inside me. I wasn't going to let it happen. They wouldn't kill me in silence. They wouldn't bury me like an idiot. If someone in my house wanted to poison me, they would regret it. With that thought, I stood up and opened my desk drawer. I pulled a notebook and a pen. I started writing, almost without thinking, the names of everyone present at the dinner. Next to each name, I jotted down the signs I'd noticed. Glances, gestures, possible motives. It was a desperate exercise, but it gave me a certain calm. It was like taking control of my fear, turning it into a plan. On the list were my wife, my children, my sons-in-law, my daughters-in-law, even the cousins. No one was left out. No one was safe from my suspicion. Dawn found me like that, writing and crossing things out, my eyes red and my heart racing. I hadn't slept a minute, but in the midst of that insomnia, I felt something in me had changed. I was no longer the naive man who sat at the table believing in his family's unity. I was a man who had seen the shadow of death on his own plate and who was now willing to look every single one of them in the eye to find out who had served it. When the sun began to filter through the window, I got up and looked in the mirror. The face staring back at me wasn't that of a defeated old man. It was the face of someone who, despite the pain and fear, had reclaimed something he thought he'd lost, his will. And with that will, I promised myself I would find the traitor, that I would rip the mask from their face, even if it cost me my last drop of energy. That sleepless night was the point of no return. I knew with a cold certainty that my life had changed forever, and that the next time I sat at that table, it wouldn't be to celebrate, but to unmask. At dawn the next day, my eyes still burning from lack of sleep, I got up, determined not to let the night's events fade into a mere suspicion. I felt a mix of fury and dizziness in my chest, the certainty of being saved by an anonymous call and the conviction that the danger came from within, from those who had eaten at my table and hugged me just hours before. I started with the basics. Don't confront anyone without more than a hunch. If I wanted to get out of this alive, I had to be methodical, patient, and cold. This wasn't the time for shouting. It was the time for small traps that would force the truth to show itself. The first thing was to check the kitchen carefully, though I no longer expected to find the poison on an abandoned tray. Experts confirm that many poisonings are prepared in advance and in small doses. I opened cabinets, checked bottles, inspected spice jars with the focus of a surgeon. Nothing strange at first glance. But I found a receipt folded between the napkins. A receipt from a nearby pharmacy, dated the week before, with a name that was vaguely familiar. An item that had appeared on my youngest son's expense account when I was looking over the books. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was another line on the map I was drawing in my mind. I called an old friend, one who had taught me years ago to read between the lines. I asked him to come over for coffee, and without any drama, I told him the story. I didn't want him to know everything. I was afraid the word poison would make any suspect desperate. I laid out the facts and showed him the receipt. He frowned and told me about patterns he'd seen back in his days as a shop owner, repeated purchases of medicines that didn't match any illness, nervousness before visits, excuses for missing work at key moments. He told me something that sent a shiver down my spine. Look at who has something to gain from your absence. That phrase echoed and opened up a range of possibilities in my head that I preferred not to consider. I decided then to change my routine to observe their reactions. I left my car parked on the street an extra day. I came home early 3 times without warning. I faked a phone call and listened to the tremor in the voices of those who don't know how to react to an unexpected threat. My oldest son, who had always been calm and proper, gave a start that he quickly hid. My youngest daughter, on the contrary, kept her composure with a kind of restrained bitterness that I found unbearable. She gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My son-in-law, the one who watched my plate so intently that night, showed up at my workshop under the excuse of fixing something and spent too much time looking around the house, like someone scouting for opportunities. In the following week, I set up small tests. I discreetly asked for the wine boxes and grocery store receipts to be saved. When no one was looking, I checked dates, brands, batch numbers. I found a small inconsistency. A bottle of an expensive brand appeared among the usual purchases, with a home delivery note for the same day as the dinner. Who would have ordered that bottle? The delivery was listed to the house, but with a signature of receipt from my daughter-in-law. I chatted with her casually about wine, told stories about trips, and noticed how her speech faltered when she mentioned New Year's Eve. She twisted her mouth, looked for an excuse. "I ordered it because I knew you all wanted something special," she said, but her voice sank into an empty justification. Another day, I brought a guy in to work on the yard at night, and I stayed outside in the shadows, listening to conversations as I passed. It's a bad habit of mine, I confess. Overhearing conversations lets me see the gestures that the words hide. That's how I heard my son-in-law on the phone, his tone trying to be casual, but failing. "Everything will be fine. Just wait," he said, and I, without him knowing, made a mental note. It's not that a phrase like that confirms a crime, but in the collection of small signs, it was forming a pattern. Your mind becomes a magnifying glass when someone wants to kill you. It enlarges whispers, suspects mundane phrases, turns routine into a web of traps. I couldn't stop myself from checking the family group chats when devices were left in the living room. I didn't snoop on private messages, but I searched for the idea. Had they talked about my absence? Was there some agreement or joke I had missed? I found, hidden between memes and photos, a message chain between my youngest son and his wife that mentioned the perfect opportunity, followed by laughing emojis. My heart sank. That phrase alone doesn't mean poison on a plate, but combined with the pharmacy receipt and the out-of-place bottle, it became a weight I couldn't ignore. But the bitterest, most painful suspicion was the one that hit me when I thought of my wife. I didn't want to believe that she, the woman who had shared my early mornings and my hopes, could be involved. And yet, her attitude that night, that laugh that now seemed forced, that calmness before I went to the bathroom, now showed itself in a new light. I found her looking through a photo album with an expression I couldn't read, as if she were reviewing dates and remembering names. I asked her about it in a neutral voice, and she said she was just reminiscing, nothing more. Her hand closed for an instant on my elbow, and I felt cold. I didn't want to see her as different from my memories, but suspicion doesn't ask for permission. It moves in, and it destroys everything. I put together a small network of allies. The friend from the coffee shop, the yard guy, a discreet neighbor who agreed to watch for deliveries. I didn't want to turn the house into a prison of watchful eyes, but into a place where the truth couldn't travel in secret. I made calls, pretending I was leaving for meetings, and in silence, I watched how the day-to-day threads moved. A few days were enough for the atmosphere to change. Conversations became shorter, excuses more elaborate, glances quicker. And I, who for years had been the one offering protection, was now the one offering suspicion. As the pieces fit together, a complex feeling washed over me. It wasn't just the fear of dying, but the sadness of having built a house with honest hands, only to discover that in that house, someone had planned my end. I felt anger, yes, but also a deep sorrow for human fragility, for how time can turn affection into a debt to be paid. However, pity wouldn't distract me. I had to choose, stay silent and accept the likely betrayal, or bring the network that wanted me dead into the light. I chose the fight. The list in my notebook was growing by the day. I marked with an X the names that, for now, demanded my urgent attention. I didn't want to accuse anyone out loud without conclusive proof. I wanted to provoke mistakes, small cracks in the strategy of someone who thought they were above suspicion. Because the poison that is served in secret is revealed in careless mistakes. A poorly filed receipt, a misdirected call, drinking too much that same night. I would follow that path. Patience, observation, subtle pressure, until the truth cracked and fell where it was supposed to. And while the family continued with their lives as if nothing had happened, work, school, shopping, I prepared myself for the inevitable, to confront the one who wanted me dead. It wouldn't be a reckless action. It would be a reconstruction, a calculated exposure. I would make those who laughed that night, who toasted and hugged me, see what I saw in silence, that in their midst enough hatred had grown to put poison on my plate, and that no family comfort, no routine, no excuse would save me from seeking the justice that now burned in me. The anonymous ally turned out to be Rose, my wife's younger sister, a quiet woman who always sat on the sidelines of our family conversations. Her voice on the phone was trembling. She told me she couldn't let anyone in her own blood take my life. I never thought that quiet Rose was capable of something like this. When I heard her, I felt relief and shame. Relief because her warning saved me. Shame because I hadn't seen the signs that she had. Rose told me she'd been noticing strange movements in the house for weeks, during the afternoons and evenings. Packages arriving and disappearing, jars that used to be in the pantry and weren't anymore. Pharmacy purchases under names she didn't recognize. She had been jotting down dates and small details, just so she wouldn't forget. I couldn't stay quiet, she told me. If something happened to you, it would have been my fault. Her sincerity moved me, her courage surprised me. What Rose revealed changed the course of my investigation. Until then, I'd been walking like a lone detective. I looked at receipts, watched glances, took notes. With her as an ally, I could act with more precision. I didn't ask her to install cameras or get into confrontations. I asked her to keep observing naturally and to let me know with discreet signals. We agreed on something simple. A slightly drawn curtain in the kitchen meant she'd seen something relevant. A spoon left out of the sink meant alert. Humble signals, but effective in a house where everything is quickly normalized. The morning after my call, Rose left the curtain as we'd agreed. I saw the signal, and from the shadows, I watched my daughter-in-law leave early with some excuse and come back with an overly heavy bag that she left at the entrance. I also saw my son-in-law come in the back door at an odd hour. It wasn't legal proof, but it confirmed a pattern. Calculated movements, schedules that were coinciding in a way that was starting to look less than casual. Rose told me that on the night of the dinner, she'd seen him stuff a package into the garage trash can with nervous hands. She described it as if the image were still burned into her memory. Furthermore, Rose taught me to see gestures I had dismissed. She pointed out the way my daughter-in-law placed the napkins, my oldest son's tick when he looked away, the hurried movement with which my son-in-law cleared the table. She showed me notes she'd written in a notebook, marks on the edge of a box, a stain on a napkin, a poorly logged delivery in the house ledger. None of these details alone proved a crime, but together they began to form a web that a hand had intentionally woven. Rose also recounted incomplete conversations she'd overheard. She told me that one afternoon, her daughter-in-law was talking on the phone and said quickly, "It's almost time, don't mess up," and hung up with that short, tense breath that betrays stress. Hearing that chilled me. Alone, that phrase could be any chat. Within the pattern Rose had drawn, it was a confirmation that didn't allow me to return to innocence. I asked her to write everything down without drama, to continue as normally as possible, and to avoid putting herself at the center of things. With her support, I changed my tactic. I let them do their work and provoked small errors. I organized small meals and, in casual conversation, commented on the pantry or the wine to see who got flustered. At one such dinner, my youngest son blurted out, "It's almost all ready," and then turned red. It was a slip that, under normal circumstances, would have gone unnoticed. With Rose watching and with everything else fitting into place, it became one more piece of the puzzle. Rose acted with almost heroic discretion. She'd call me from the store with some excuse and tell me something between the lines. "There's a box by the clothesline," or "I left it in the shed." Small maneuvers that allowed me to follow the trail of deliveries and purchases. It was like following breadcrumbs. One clue led to another until the path became clear. On one occasion, she told me she had seen the daughter-in-law hide a jar in a drawer where I never put my hands. That gesture, which for many would be trivial, now took on the gravity of a premeditated action. There were nights when I thought I was pushing her too far. Rose trembled as she recounted what she saw, and my voice broke hearing her. I begged her not to expose herself, not to do anything that could put her in danger, but she responded with the simplicity of someone acting out of loyalty. "If I stay silent and something happens to you, I'll have condemned myself to live with that guilt. I'd rather put my peace of mind aside." It wasn't spectacular heroism. It was the everyday courage of someone who prioritizes another's life over their own quiet. With Rose, I confirmed details that would have remained invisible without her. The daughter-in-law had ordered special napkins the week of the dinner. The son-in-law visited a pharmacy several times with unconvincing excuses. My youngest son changed his schedule one afternoon without explanation. None of that was the poison itself, but they were the threads that, when pulled, allowed the whole thing to unravel. I decided not to rush. I wanted the truth to emerge without anyone being able to say, "I invented it out of resentment." Rose became my eyes in the house. She would drop an innocent comment into the right conversation about hearing a noise or seeing a package. The reactions she provoked were revealing. On one occasion, she let slip that she'd heard talk of medicine bought without a prescription, and the daughter-in-law laughed, startled. Small tests that served to observe guilt. Her silent work gave me the opportunity to plan the exposure calmly and with concrete evidence. Rose's involvement was also a moral act. Her anonymous call on New Year's Eve saved me, and her follow-up gave me time to build a strategy based on truth, not blind revenge. When I finally called her to thank her, her voice broke with relief. and she said she did it because she couldn't let the family bury its guilt in silence. I felt gratitude, and also the shame of not having seen what she saw. I promised her I would protect her name and her peace, that her courage would not condemn her to being ostracized for having spoken up. She was decisive. The following days became a dangerous game, a game of chess where I had to move my pieces silently, waiting for the enemy to make a mistake. Now I wasn't alone. Thanks to Rose, I had gained an unexpected ally, someone with the courage to watch where I couldn't. However, the weight of suspicion continued to crush me, and every gesture from the family seemed like a hidden signal. I forced myself to look at the everyday with different eyes. The kitchen, once a space of aromas and recipes, was now a laboratory where poison could be hidden. I carefully checked the spice jars, the wine bottles, the leftovers that went into the trash. Every finding, no matter how small, I noted in my notebook. That's how I noticed the first of the disturbing details, a box of prescription drugs that no one in the house used. The name on the label was scratched off, but the bottle was half full. The pharmacist, whom I consulted discreetly, told me those pills could be crushed and easily lost in food. Another day, while pretending to read in the living room, I saw my son-in-law slip into the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator, moved some containers, and put something in the bottom drawer. When I got up minutes later, there was nothing strange, except for a small damp spot on the floor, like a jar had dripped. I couldn't accuse him without proof, but every sign reinforced my certainty that the danger was still there. Latent. My oldest son also began to worry me. He had always been reserved, but now that reservation was turning into a sharp coldness. When I spoke to him, he responded in monosyllables. When he spoke to his mother, he lowered his voice. One night I overheard, by chance, a phrase that stuck in my memory. "It can't last much longer." I didn't know what he was referring to, but in my mind, it translated into a sentence against me. My youngest daughter, on the other hand, was the one it hurt most to suspect. She had inherited my stubbornness, and our arguments had always been intense. I remembered her as a little girl, clinging to my leg so I wouldn't go to work, begging me to stay home. Now, seeing her as an adult, with that hard smile that didn't reach her eyes, I wondered if that little girl still existed somewhere in her heart, or if resentment had erased every trace of filial love. Rose kept watching. One afternoon, she whispered in my ear, "Your wife knew something before the dinner." I heard her on the phone saying that everything had to go perfectly that night. When I heard her, a chill ran through my body. I didn't want to believe it. The woman who had shared my whole life, who had been my partner in good times and bad. Could she have been part of such an atrocious plan? I couldn't rush into a confrontation yet. I needed more. So I decided to provoke. One morning, during breakfast, I said out loud, "I've decided to review my will. I might change a few things." I didn't look at anyone in particular, but the silence that fell over the table was telling. My son dropped his spoon into his coffee cup. My son-in-law pressed his lips together. My wife feigned indifference, but her fingers clenched the tablecloth. There were no words, but there were gestures, and in those gestures, the truth was hidden. Every day, the puzzle became a little more complete. I knew I was close to unmasking the traitor, but I also understood I was playing with fire. One false move, and the poison could reappear at my table, this time without a warning. The battle was just beginning. The first time I decided to confront them, I didn't do it with shouts or open accusations. It wasn't the time. I understood that if I wanted to rip their masks off, I had to do it subtly, like someone playing chess and forcing their opponent to make the wrong move. So I sat at the table with them, at another one of those family meals that were no longer celebrations, but silent battlefields, and I began to drop carefully measured phrases. "They say this year will be tough for many, especially for those who are depending on an early inheritance," I said, calmly cutting a piece of bread. I didn't look up right away, but I felt the air grow heavy. My son-in-law shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, and drank his wine with nervous haste. My youngest daughter forced a laugh and said I always exaggerated. My wife, however, remained silent, a silence that weighed more than any word. During that meal, I left the plate in front of me untouched as a reminder of the New Year's Eve dinner. I watched everyone's reactions. Lately, I've been thinking about how quickly a man's life can change. 1 minute you're here, and the next you can disappear. Some smiled, others looked down. My oldest son choked on a piece of meat and said I was being too somber for a family lunch. I replied with a dry smile. Sometimes you have to talk about death to make life meaningful. It was a cruel game, but a necessary one. I wanted to see who could handle the pressure, who showed nervousness, who kept their composure. I watched the trembling fingers, the shifty eyes, the discomfort disguised as laughter. Little by little, I started to find cracks. The daughter-in-law, usually the most talkative, was unusually quiet. My son-in-law talked too much, like someone trying to fill a dangerous void with words. My youngest daughter avoided looking at me directly, and when she did, her eyes flashed with a mix of defiance and guilt. One of those afternoons, I decided to go further. I took the pharmacy receipt I had found weeks ago out of my pocket and put it on the table without saying anything. I left it there, next to the salt shaker, like any other object. I saw my oldest son turn pale. I also saw how my wife pretended not to recognize it, though her eyes scanned it quickly. No one dared to ask what I was doing with that paper, and I didn't explain. I just put it away again after a few minutes, with a studied calm. The silence that followed was deafening. I also started asking questions disguised as anecdotes. Isn't it funny how they used to poison kings? It was always the people closest to them, the ones who shared their table, the ones who had the perfect opportunity. I laughed, as if it were a casual comment, but I saw my son-in-law drop his fork. My youngest daughter commented dryly that I watched too many movies, and my wife said coldly, "That only happened in the old days." But none of them could hide the discomfort my words caused. Every time I dropped a hint, I noted the reaction in my notebook. Over time, I began to notice a pattern. There was shared nervousness, but it was especially concentrated in a small group. I no longer suspected everyone. The circle was shrinking. The gestures, the silences, the fleeting glances, everything indicated there was a shared secret between some of them. The betrayal wasn't individual. It was a conspiracy. One night, while we were having coffee, I dared to say, "Sometimes I think about how I was saved that day, about that call I got at just the right moment. Can you imagine? If it weren't for that voice, I might not be sitting here right now." I said it like a reflection, but the bomb had been dropped. No one knew that I had already discovered it was Rose who had warned me. I wanted to see how they reacted to hearing that someone, inside or outside the family, had been watching, and the reaction was revealing. My son-in-law immediately looked at my youngest daughter, and she turned pale. That chain of gestures confirmed more than any words. That veiled confrontation made it clear to me that the masks were beginning to crack. There were no open confessions, of course, but every gesture was silent proof. Every moment of discomfort was another brick in the wall I was building against them. I knew with a mix of pain and determination that the hour of truth was approaching. Soon, one of them would make a mistake from which they couldn't come back. The truth didn't fall all at once, like a lightning strike. It appeared little by little, like a stain spreading over a clean cloth until it covers it completely. I had suspected many. I'd played with the uncertainty of not knowing who to trust. But that day, after weeks of observation and uncomfortable silences, the mask finally broke, and what I found behind it tore me apart more than the poison on the plate. It was Rose, again, who gave me the last piece. One afternoon, she called me, her voice choked. She had overheard my wife arguing with my youngest daughter in the kitchen. They weren't clear sentences, but scraps. "I can't take this waiting anymore. You have to be patient. We can't fail again." My heart stopped. It wasn't just a suspicion, it was a confirmation. My wife and my daughter were in on it. The blow was brutal, as if everything I'd ever believed about my own family was ripped out by the roots. I locked myself in my room with the notebook, where I'd written down every detail. I reread the gestures, the phrases, the glances, over and over. It all fit. My wife's nervous laughter during dinner, her uncomfortable silence at my insinuations, her fleeting gaze when I talked about the inheritance. And my daughter, her resentment over past arguments, her poison-laced words disguised as irony, her coldness whenever I spoke of sacrifice. It had been right in front of me the whole time, and I had refused to see it. I remembered that argument with my daughter when she called me stingy because I wouldn't lend her money for a business that, according to her, would be her independence. I told her I couldn't just give her everything, that she had to learn to fight for it like I did. Since then, she had treated me with a hardness I didn't want to accept. Now I understood. It wasn't just resentment, it was cultivated hatred. For her, I was the obstacle, the old man standing between her ambition and the money she felt she was owed. But the worst part was understanding my wife's involvement. I had shared more than 40 years with her. We had raised children, mourned losses, celebrated achievements. I never imagined she held such corrosive bitterness inside. According to what Rose heard, she was fed up, tired of living in my shadow, of everything in the house revolving around me. She said she wanted to be free, to start over, and that my presence was the chain that kept her tied. Free from what? From me? From my love? My care? That question pierced my soul. The final confirmation came the night I decided to spy on them. I faked a business trip, as I had done before, and came back silently in the dead of night. The house was dark, but I heard voices in the kitchen. I walked slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and there they were, my wife and my daughter sitting at the table with an open box of medication. They were talking in whispers, planning how to dissolve the pills without leaving a trace. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't a suspicion. It was the brutal, tangible reality. I felt my legs tremble, the air leave my lungs. I wanted to burst into the kitchen and scream, to demand explanations, but I held back. I stayed listening from the shadows, tears burning in my eyes. My daughter was saying, "Dad's old, he won't last much longer. It's better if it's quick so we can all stop suffering." And my wife, my life partner, replied, "The important thing is that it looks natural. No one can suspect a thing." Those sentences stabbed me like knives. They, the women I had loved and protected, who had lived off my sacrifices, were planning my death with the coldness of someone organizing a move. There was no doubt. It was them. And their motives, though poisoned by resentment and greed, were right there, exposed. Money, exhaustion, the ambition for a life without me. That morning, I locked myself in my study and cried like a child, not from fear, but from the raw pain. To discover that the greatest betrayal came from those I had loved the most was a pain no words can describe. But also, in the midst of those tears, something else was born, the certainty that I couldn't just stand by. If they wanted me dead, I had to show them I was still alive, that I still had the strength to face them. The next morning, I faked normalcy. I said hello, I smiled, I acted like always. But inside, I carried a firm decision. Sooner or later, my wife and my daughter would pay for what they had tried to do. I myself would make sure that everyone knew who they really were. And when I did, there would be no turning back. Summoning them was the coldest, most calculated part of the whole plan. I told them it was a meal to clear up some family matters. I set the table with the same care as always and asked everyone to come, children, sons-in-law, daughters-in-law, cousins, and Rose, who sat in a quiet corner. In each envelope, next to the plate, I left copies of receipts, photos, and transcripts that wove together the story I knew from my notebook. As the meal progressed, I talked about trivial things so no one would suspect. I told stories about the house, talked about the yard, but my voice had an edge. No one sensed what was coming until I put the first piece of evidence on the table. I took the pharmacy receipt and placed it in front of my youngest son. "Explain this," I said. The color drained from his face. The scene changed in an instant. The conversation stopped, and a thick silence filled the dining room. Then I showed the photos of the deliveries, the receipts for purchases made at impossible hours, and the printed-out page of messages where my daughter talked about opportunities. Each document was a piece confirming what I had already suspected. My wife tried to get up, to make excuses, to deny it, but the evidence was there, cold and conclusive. My daughter made a gesture I will never forget. She covered her mouth, and in her eyes, I saw the surrender of someone who has been caught. When I looked at her, she spoke. She didn't deny the plot. She explained her logic with a trembling voice. "Dad, I thought if you were gone, the house would be ours. We could pay off the debts. We could start a new life." The sentence sounded terrible. It wasn't a rational defense. It was the confession of an ambition that, to her, justified the crime. My wife, for her part, pleaded for compassion. "I was tired of being a shadow," she said, as if years of care justified the plan. The words became knives. The reaction was immediate and violent. Some family members recoiled, others cried, and my oldest son, who had always defended me in public, broke down in gut-wrenching sobs. I felt in that moment that the house was splitting in two. On one side were those who couldn't believe this was possible. On the other, those who saw the evidence and couldn't look away. I stayed calm. The exposure had to be clear and without theatrical rage. I didn't want to give them the defense of saying I was putting on a show. I asked for the police to be called, not out of a desire for immediate revenge, but so the evidence could be certified and there would be no room for doubt. An officer arrived, took notes, reviewed the copies, and listened to the transcripts. When he did, I saw in his face that my version wasn't a fantasy. The law began to take shape, and with it, the possibility of real consequences for those who had wanted to end my life. My wife collapsed into tears that weren't looking for comfort, but for clemency. She recalled fragments of our shared life. She asked that we consider her exhaustion as a mitigating factor. My daughter talked about debts, about pressure, about sleepless nights. She tried to tangle up motives to soften an act that admits no softness. I listened to it all, not to forgive, but to understand the extent of the damage. Knowing why someone wants you dead doesn't bring back the past, but at least it explains the nature of the betrayal. The grandkids were the most affected. At first, they didn't understand. Then, they felt the tension and pulled away, as if the house had become a strange place. Seeing my little granddaughter looking on with big, confused eyes broke my heart. I went to her, hugged her, and in that embrace, I understood that my obligation was to protect them from what had happened and also from those who had caused the harm. The family was fragmented, and something in its fabric had to be rebuilt. As the officers collected the evidence, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I had managed to expose the truth and drag it out of the silence, but at a price. The house I had dreamed of for warmth and protection had become a stage of open wounds. Those present dispersed, trembling with a mixture of shame and disbelief. Some looked at me with respect, others with hatred. It didn't matter. The truth was out, and nothing would put it back in the dark. That night, the police took some items and took statements. There were no immediate arrests. The investigation had to run its course. As I watched the officers leave, I understood that I had won something irreplaceable, the certainty that no one could kill my memory with complicit silence. I had exposed the betrayal, and that was enough as a first step. I went to bed without sleeping, like so many nights. But this time, it wasn't from uncertainty, but from the intensity of the day. I felt the house was empty, not just physically, but because of the distance that had grown between those of us who lived in it. I thought about the future, about possible trials, about the loss of trust, about how we would rebuild a life without the one who had tried to rip me from it. I also thought about Rose and her bravery. I owed her my life, and I wouldn't let her gesture be forgotten. I wasn't looking for a cruel display. I wanted a balance between reparation and punishment for the family to learn that lives are not bought with silence. And so, with the truth exposed, I began to chart the path of my recovery. The calculated vengeance began in the hours following the revelation. It wasn't an act of uncontrolled rage, but a cold strategy, designed so the truth wouldn't be diluted by excuses or late tears. I understood that if I wanted my family to pay the moral and legal price for what they did, I had to build a case that left no loopholes, organized evidence, formal complaints, and measures to protect the innocent, especially my grandchildren. First, I secured the legal backing. A lawyer, an old acquaintance with integrity, agreed to take the case. I gave him all the receipts, Rose's notes, the delivery logs, and the notebook where I'd jotted down suspicious behaviors. We had long meetings where we went over the strategy, how to file the complaint without it being perceived as personal revenge, what kind of restraining orders should we request, and how to protect the evidence so it couldn't be altered. I wanted justice to work, not public opinion, and for that, We needed flawless documentation. While the legal process moved forward, I secured the house. I changed the locks that night, had cards and temporary bank access blocked, and I separated joint bank accounts. I didn't do it with a big show. I did it with the calmness of someone setting non-negotiable boundaries. I knew the public humiliation would come on its own when the truth was proven, but I also understood that, before that moment, I had to preserve what was mine and what belonged to the children. Protecting my assets wasn't being greedy. It was being responsible. At the same time, I took control of the narrative. I wouldn't let the story be told incorrectly, for my name to be questioned by malicious interpretations. I spoke with trusted relatives, shared the steps I was taking with Rose, and asked that no one try to mediate behind closed doors. I wanted the exposure to be transparent and for justice to have a clear path. I asked for discretion, but not complicit silence. I wanted the truth, not the comfort of indifference. Social pressure was a subtle tool. I didn't seek a media circus. I preferred for the community, that small network that sometimes knows more than it lets on, to understand what had happened. Some friends called for quiet conversations. Neighbors offered to testify about strange movements. All of that, added to the technical evidence, gave my case a solid structure. I felt the house ceased to be a refuge and became a place where the law could also enter. However, the vengeance also demanded a symbolic dimension. I wanted the end of the domestic bond to be visible, so no one would confuse abandonment with forgiveness. So I planned a direct gesture, to remove the clothes from the house that represented our life together, the things my wife and I had shared for years. Not for the pleasure of humiliating, but to make a clear point. Whoever tries to murder their partner does not deserve to remain under the same roof. I asked Rose and a loyal nephew for help. We went into the room, with the calm of one respecting the private, and with hands that did not tremble, we began to remove clothes. Pajamas, dresses, folded shirts, everything went into boxes. We carried them out to the curb in front of the house and displayed them with the firmness of an act that seeks not a spectacle, but closure. People passed by. Some looked with disgust, others with curiosity, and a few with an understanding that comforted me. I understood that symbolic violence is also a form of justice when the family bond has been broken by treachery. The day I placed those boxes on the street, I felt a mix of relief and bitterness. Relief because I no longer shared my daily space with a person who had planned my death. Bitterness because the story of a shared life was ending like this, with clothes on the sidewalk and judging eyes. Still, I didn't regret it. The line had to be drawn to protect the kids and to let society know that in this house there would be no impunity. I didn't seek gratuitous humiliation. I sought a clear end. I proceeded with caution. During the preliminary hearings, I kept my composure. I showed up with organized documents, witnesses who corroborated deliveries and movements, and the report from the private investigator I'd hired. Seeing the DA's office start to take the evidence seriously gave me an unexpected calm. I wasn't looking for bloody revenge. I was looking for reparation and safety. The law, when it's on the right side, is a tool for restoring dignity. Meanwhile, some tried to soften me. Letters, pleading calls, promises of change. My wife swore repentance. My daughter cried in private and begged for forgiveness in sobs that failed to convince me. I responded with practical silence. The legal channels would continue, and any negotiation would have to be public and with clear conditions. And above all, I would not allow contact between them and my grandchildren without supervision. The protection of the children was non-negotiable. Their peace was worth more than any hasty reconciliation. There was a moment when I knew the vengeance had found its just form. The community gave me back its trust and the legal proceedings were moving forward. It wasn't the satisfaction of victory, but the feeling of having acted with a cool head against betrayal. The emotional shock passed, and what remained was the peace of knowing I no longer lived under the threat of a poisoned plate. I regained more than safety. I regained control over my life. The last stage was administrative and symbolic, making the separation of assets official, changing beneficiaries on documents, and ensuring the house was protected for the grandkids. That task was not small. It involved paperwork, signatures, and tough conversations with banks and lawyers, but every stamp, every completed form, represented a step toward reconstruction. It was the bureaucracy of a repair that, although cold, was necessary so that the betrayal would not be rewarded. Vengeance, I learned, isn't just punishment. It's a restoration of your own life. Mine had been put in check by greed and the exhaustion of others. Restoring my dignity also meant reorganizing the future so the children wouldn't pay the price of the betrayal. And so, with orderly steps, I began to reclaim my home. Not the same one, perhaps, but a place where the truth was beginning to become law. There were still sleepless nights where the echo of their voices seemed to stick to the walls of the house. Even so, that restlessness faded with every resolved issue, with every gesture that protected the grandkids. Sometimes I'd pass by the empty room and feel the weight of the years. Other times, however, I felt a new peace, strange and decisive. I'd closed a door that hurt to close, but in doing so, I opened another that would let me live without fear. Today. The day I decided to close this cycle began like any other, with the sun just filtering through the curtains and the cold morning air coming in the window. But inside me, there was no routine, only a determination that burned fiercely. I had spent weeks unmasking those I thought would never fail me. I had endured the pain of discovering that my wife and daughter plotted my death. I had gathered evidence, endured false tears, and listened to excuses that could no longer erase the reality. Now, the time had come to put a final stop to it. I went downstairs to the living room and saw the suitcases I'd packed the night before. Inside were their belongings, clothes, shoes, purses, even the photographs where they posed as if the family were a sacred bond. All of it was now a reminder of the betrayal. I carried them calmly, without trembling, and I left them, one by one, on the street. Every object I placed on the sidewalk was a quiet blow of justice, a way of telling them they no longer belonged in my life or my house. The neighbors started to peek out. Some stood still, surprised. Others whispered among themselves, and a few looked at me with a mix of respect and pity. I didn't look down. Let them all see. Let them all know that the man they tried to murder wasn't willing to hide what happened. The shame wouldn't be mine, but theirs. For planning my death with the coldness of a financial calculation and the poison of an old resentment. My wife was at the door, her face distorted. She screamed at me that this was unnecessary, that we could talk about it, that I was exaggerating. Her voice sounded desperate, not for love, but for fear of losing everything. My youngest daughter, on the other hand, just looked at me with rage, with those eyes full of resentment that I had so often mistaken for simple teenage rebellion. Now I understood that in that gaze, the hatred that almost killed me had bloomed. "You are no longer part of this house," I told them, with a calm that surprised even me. "What you tried to do is unforgivable. You can cry, you can scream, but what you will never have again is my trust." Their tears didn't move me. For years I had believed that blood ties were unbreakable, that a wife's love was eternal, that a father's sacrifices were enough to be respected. Now I knew that all of it could be broken, that ambition, exhaustion, and greed could wipe out decades of memories. I closed the door slowly, leaving their pleas and the neighbors' murmurs behind. Inside the house, I was hit with a different kind of silence, not loneliness, but peace. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what might be on my plate, or of the whispers in the kitchen, or of the hushed conversations when I wasn't around. That silence was my victory. It wasn't a loud victory, but it was a definitive one. I went up to the bedroom and sat at the desk, where my notebook still rested, the one where I'd noted every gesture, every suspicion, every piece of evidence. I opened it and scanned the pages until I reached the last one. There, I wrote with a steady hand. The poison didn't kill me because I learned to open my eyes. The betrayal was their sentence. The truth was my revenge. I closed the notebook and put it in the drawer. It was my testimony, my reminder that I had survived what would have destroyed many. I looked at an old photograph of my grandchildren. They weren't guilty of anything. They were the true victims of a story of greed and betrayal. I swore in silence that I would never leave them at the mercy of the same darkness that had tried to take my life. That promise was my new reason to keep going. That night, before going to sleep, I went to the window and saw the boxes still on the curb. No one had dared to touch them. The wind moved some of the clothes, and the shadows from the streetlights stretched over them like a sentence. I didn't feel sadness. I felt relief. Everything that represented the betrayal was out of my life. As I closed the window, I understood that my story hadn't ended with poison on a plate, but with my dignity intact. I survived not only because someone warned me in time, but because I had the courage to face the truth. The betrayal had tried to bury me, but I chose to live. And living, in this case, was my deepest revenge.